So they know a little bit about what we discussed, and we'll just take it away from there. And I think the format is Bruce is going to talk, then we'll have Q&A, then Ruth will talk, we'll have Q&A. So we'll kind of break it up a little bit. You should just close it.
Well, someone's coming.
Oh, all right. Okay, go ahead, take it away.
Cool. So my name is Bruce Busher. For those who don't know me, this is my wife Ruthie. She's Dave Snoke's daughter. I'm her husband. Connections. So we are both artists. At the moment we're on kind of a long road trip to do several different artist residencies around the country. So we'll be spending some time in studio spaces at these various residencies working on some different things. I have a background in architecture. I'm focusing on painting right now. Ruthie has a background in theater and is going to be working on writing and research and playwriting. So we spent the last couple weeks here in Pittsburgh and are really thankful to be here giving this talk.
Yep.
So we're here to talk about art and faith generally. So I'm just this is kind of a lot that I'm going to do up front in a condensed amount of time, so I'm just going to throw stuff out there and then we'll spend some time discussing it. So I want to stay away from the dichotomy that there's secular and sacred art, at least at the beginning, because I think that can get people into some unhelpful territory. So I'd like to just start by talking about what is art in general. So I think it's helpful to kind of talk about what art is not. It's not science, it's not politics, it's not medicine, it's not spirituality. Other things could be added to the list, but essentially art is its own kind of irreducible aspect of life. It can't be contained as a subset in something else, even though often people use it for any number of those other things. And really quick, since I think a number of you don't have a background in art, I think it's helpful to have a very brief overview of art history. So, in the ancient world, art was typically used to talk about deities, worship, and the afterlife. So here is an Egyptian example where this guy has died, there's some deity tending to him, and presumably the background is about what to do or not to do in your life to succeed in the afterlife. In the Greek and Roman eras, it was really about kind of ideal forms and proportions. So here you see kind of an anatomically correct statue, sort of ideal posture. So it's really about sort of these kind of human ideals. In the Middle Ages, things get wonky. Perspective kind of goes out the window, but it's really about storytelling. So it's about conveying usually religious or political ideas. But you can see here people are like really different sizes, and people wouldn't fit through the doorways that they're showing. So, also at the same time in Asia, there was kind of a long tradition of landscape painting, and it was really generally about kind of the spiritual aspects of landscape and kind of a path to enlightenment of some kind. And then in the Renaissance, it's really about depicting the world much more realistically than in the Middle Ages. So perspective shows up again. People are kind of shown more correctly, and it's about high ideals that were happening at the time. In the Impressionist era, it was really about showing a temporal world, so time was really important. So these guys were going out and painting on site very quickly in different times of day. And then you get the onset of modernism, where it was really saying art is really just about its essential components, nothing more. So you see some shapes and some colors and some random forms on the canvas. Then you get conceptual art, which is really about the idea and the art as serving the mind, not the eye. So this is a urinal that Duchamp brought into an art exhibit, and the artwork was actually the fact that he was saying something about the role of the artist in the artwork, not the actual thing itself. And then more recently, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's about art as the experience of art. Yeah. So this is actually not a floating rectangle. It's a carefully cut hole in a wall. But the idea is not about the hole in the wall, it's about how you perceive the artwork.
So wait, is the art a whole, or is this a picture of somebody looking at the art, or is the whole thing the art?
Just the blue thing is the art.
Okay, so she's not.
Yeah, imagine yourself as the person.
She's an art maid because she's yeah.
Yeah. And then now, in contemporary art, it's really kind of about pluralism, like anything goes. And that was kind of exemplified in the Obama's presidential portraits. You can see a lot of different styles happening here from different time periods in history. So we're kind of in that pluralist phase right now. So just to go back to what is art, I think there's three things that have to be at play for it to be considered a work of art: creative inspiration, material, and what I'm calling reality revelation. So creative inspiration, if you think about it, art can really be about anything. There's no specific subject matter. Art is not an intellectual activity. You don't have to be smart. And you can't teach people how to be a good artist. You can teach them things related to their craft, but not how to make a good piece of art. So if you can't teach any of these things, if you don't have to be smart, what is it? I think there's two sources of creative ambition that we can talk about. The first is the self. So artists are always, to some degree, involved in kind of self-promotion. They're motivated by acclaim, acceptance, validation, etc. This might seem like a bad thing. I think in a lot of cases it can actually be good, but it can also lead to an attitude of art is my life, there's nothing else, and that's where you get kind of tortured artist types and people who are sort of jerks about it. But I want to warn you to not throw this out completely because I think it's important. This art critic, Sebastian Smee, says, if powerful artists often defy conventional morality, it is probably just because conventional morality dilutes in endless obligations and self-corrections the intensity and conviction, the tunnel vision that is required to create great art. Protecting that intensity and conviction demands degrees of selfishness. But there's also the divine ambition. So as Christians, we believe that there's something beyond the self that we can look to for creativity, because we're creative beings created in the image of a creative God. And so creativity is actually kind of us imaging our creator. And because God created the universe, there's latent meaning in creation. Basically, you can go out into the world and you can discover stuff that's there to be discovered. It's not all meaningless. And so it's encouraging that art has an ultimate concern beyond ourself. So Christian Wyman, in his book My Bright Abyss, says, still there is something that any artist is in pursuit of and is answerable to, some nexus of one's being, one's material, and being itself. Inspiration is when these three things collide or collude. For any artist alert to his own soul, this crisis is the only call that matters. I know no name for it besides God, but people have other names or no names. So here you can see he's saying that really inspiration is a nexus of one's being, i.e. existence, one's material, kind of the medium you're working in, and being itself, meaning some kind of divine ambition, God, whatever you want to call it. So the second part, so we have creative ambition, or creative inspiration. The second part involved in a work of art is material. So this is where you get kind of whatever medium the artist is working in. So I think that every inspiration has a true and proper material domain, what we typically call the medium. So if you're inspired to make something that involves narrative, there's probably certain mediums that you would go to more than others to convey that. So this kind of, people started thinking about this more in modernism, where they were saying, okay, painting, for example, is not about depicting the world realistically, because we now have photography for that. So what is unique to painting? Well, it's flatness, that you're putting kind of color and shape on a flat surface. Similarly, sculpture and architecture, the unique thing about those is the three-dimensional space. With music, the unique thing is rhythm and tone. So these are all kind of domains of these mediums that don't exist or aren't the primary element of other things. So typically artists only work in one or two of these. So again, when Christian Wyman talks about the collision of being and material, he's talking about artists who are trained in the material and inspiration coming to them that makes most sense in that material form. So Martin Heidegger is a philosopher. He has a lot of really good stuff about what makes a work of art art. He says, to be sure, the sculptor uses stone just as the mason uses it in his own way, but he does not use it up. That happens in a certain way only where the work miscarries. To be sure, the painter also uses pigment, but in such a way that color is not used up, but rather only now comes to shine forth. To be sure, the poet also uses the word, not, however, like the ordinary speakers and writers who have to use them up, but rather in such a way that the word only now becomes and remains truly a word. So he's saying that artists are actually capable of taking the material that they're working in and giving it kind of its ultimate purpose to shine forth as that material, rather than using it up as you might see in other professions or industries. So we have creative inspiration, material, and the last thing I want to talk about is reality revelation. So what do I mean by this? I mean that art has the capability of revealing things to us. So it reveals, as Christians we believe it either reveals the truth of the created world or it doesn't reveal anything, because if it's not revealing truth, there's nothing else to reveal. So one way to think about this is unhealthy societies tend to fear art because it might reveal their falsehoods. And healthy societies allow for many types of artists doing many different things. Another way to think about it on more of an individual level is we're all on a spectrum of kind of self-knowledge, of how much we kind of know the truth about ourselves or are deceiving ourselves. So if you approach someone directly about their self-deception, it can be kind of ineffective. You know, if you just go to them directly and say, like, hey, you're lying to yourself, that often can't be taken very well. But art has the ability to sort of lie us into the truth or bring us into the truth more gracefully. Emily Dickinson famously says, tell the truth, but tell it slant. So art is really about kind of bringing you into a revelation of truth that doesn't seem like a blatant statement of it. And similarly, we're all on a spectrum of God knowledge. How much do we know God? How much do we know His creation? We can be living in a sense of reality or a sense of irreality. So I believe that good art actually has the capability of revealing something about God, creation, and the human condition to us. One side note about this, a lot of art, I'm going to use this thing, a lot of art is focused on the human condition, meaning our brokenness, and is often created, really spectacular art is created by non-Christians. I think it's actually possible for non-Christians to make art that reveals our condition to us in a really deep way. We were talking with Gaia 3 the other night, and she was talking about John Steinbeck's book, East of Eden, and she was saying that John Steinbeck couldn't help himself but be a Christian when he was writing that, even though in his personal life it's doubtful that he actually was a Christian. So he was actually capable of creating art that reveals something about truth to us, even when he himself didn't necessarily adhere to it in his personal life.
Sort of true of Victor Hugo, too.
Yeah, so, yeah, kind of lots of artists. Yeah, and
it's one of the best Christian novels.
Yeah, exactly. And it gets back to kind of this idea of, is art coming from the self or is it coming from outside of the self? And oftentimes it's a mixture of both, but God uses people who aren't necessarily Christians as conduits for really great stuff that can speak to the rest of us. So again, I don't think there's much of a sacred secular divide in art per se. You can challenge me on that if you want. But I believe that there's art that tells us something about the human condition, creation, and the creator, and then art that does not. So again, Christian Wyman, these days I'm impatient with poetry that is not steeped in, marred, and transfigured by the world. By that I don't necessarily mean a poetry that has some obvious social concern or is meticulous with its descriptions, but a poetry in which you can feel that the imagination of the poet has been both charged and chastened by a full encounter with the world and other lives. So this is where I got the title, A Full Encounter with Creation. He says a full encounter with the world here. So I want to briefly talk about 3 paintings that I think do this to some extent. So this is called The Ambassadors. It's by Hans Holbein the Younger from 1532. Has anyone seen this before? Yes? Okay. Don't give away the secret. So it's called The Ambassadors. Presumably the 2 guys are ambassadors. They're bringing gifts to present to a foreign power. And if you look at the things on the table, you see some globes, some instruments, books, some tools of measurement or navigation. He's holding a telescope. So it's clearly they're bringing gifts that talk about the world, exploration, kind of gaining worldly power and possessions. But there's this weird thing right here. Does anyone know what that is?
It's like a charred log.
Yeah, it looks like a charred log.
Fish.
Fish.
Looks like a skateboard.
It looks like the perspective, like if you look at it from a particular
Yeah, it looks
perspective, it would look.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like the painting from a different perspective.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what it is. So this is an anthropomorphic projection of a skull. So actually, if you look at the painting from more of an oblique angle, it kind of reveals itself to be a skull, but everything else in the painting kind of disappears. So what he was sort of saying with this is, look, there's kind of two realities. There's the worldly possessions reality, and then there's the reality of our human condition, which is death. And if you're looking at one, i.e., you know, you're searching after worldly possessions, you're probably going to miss the other. But if you're able to see that our human condition is actually that we're all going to die, you probably don't care as much about the rest of the stuff. So this is kind of an obvious way of like telling the truth a little bit, but one that I think gets to a little bit of what I'm talking about. This one is a little more subtle. It's 3 Pairs of Shoes by Van Gogh. So there's this great quote by Heidegger that I'm going to read while you look at this. So Heidegger says, "From the dark opening of the worn insides of the shoes, the toilsome tread of the worker stares forth. In the stiffly rugged heaviness of the shoes, there is the accumulated tenacity of her slow trudge through the far-spreading and ever-uniform furrows of the field, swept by a raw wind. On the leather lie the dampness and richness of the soil. Under the soles slides the loneliness of the field path as evening falls. In the shoes vibrates the silent call of the earth, its quiet gift of the ripening grain, and its unexplained self-refusal in the fallow desolation of the wintry field. This equipment is pervaded by uncomplaining anxiety as to the certainty of bread, the wordless joy of having once more withstood want." So he's actually saying that it's a painting of shoes, but it's really a painting about the existence and condition of the worker who wears the shoes. So from this you can kind of infer something about our human nature of having to work in the soil, having to walk on the earth. So it's a little more subtle, but one that I think gets a kind of a truth about our human condition. That's that quote. Lastly, this is a very austere and minimal painting by Agnes Martin from 1964. It's called The Tree. So at first glance you might think, oh no, it's another artist painting the canvas white. In fact, it's very subtle. She has these horizontal bands that are kind of alternating, and then if you look up close, there are some very fine vertical pencil lines. So she actually calls this a grid painting. And the title of The Tree is kind of intriguing. She actually says, "When I first made a grid, I happened to be thinking of the innocence of trees, and then this grid came into my mind, and I thought it represented innocence, and I still do. And so I painted it, and then I was satisfied. I thought, this is my vision." So I think it's really cool that a painting that you might kind of pass off as being too minimal or something can actually hold in it this truth about what she's calling the innocence of trees, which I think is kind of hearkening to a kind of redeemed creation. She's thinking about what is the perfect order of creation, and she kind of made an abstraction of that. She also says, "Beauty is very much broader than just to the eye. It is our whole positive response to life. An artist is fortunate in that his work is in the inner contemplation of beauty, of perfection in life. We cannot make anything perfectly, but with inner contemplation of perfection, we can suggest it." So she's kind of saying, look, the world is broken, but artists actually have this ability to sort of imagine a redeemed world, or one that isn't. So that's it for my part. That was a lot in a really short period of time, and there's so much that I feel like I passed over or could go into in each of these things. So I'd love your comments or thoughts or questions.
Yeah, let's take 10 or 15 minutes to just hunt it around a little bit. And a valid question is, could you go back to that one slide and explain that more?
What?
Move the arrow.
The arrow.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Looking at it.
What do you mean when you say we're all on a spectrum of God knowledge? Can you elaborate a little bit on that statement?
Yeah, I think, who is it? I think Sebastian Smee, the guy who I quoted up front, about artists being selfish, he talked about us being on a spectrum of self-knowledge and self-deception. So I kind of took that terminology, and then Christian Wiman talks about art as being not purely about the self. So from a Christian perspective, we have this sense that self-knowledge is not the most important thing in our lives, that actually knowledge of God is. So I think we're all kind of on a spectrum in life, hopefully moving more toward God knowledge, by which I just mean, you know, a knowledge of our Creator, which, like, should obviously come primarily through reading the Scripture, fellowship with believers, the Holy Spirit. But art can also play a role in kind of enriching our lives toward a knowledge of the Creator. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're saying that everybody is on the spectrum. Some sense you're saying common grace, that an unbeliever or somebody who even hates God would still be living in this created world and can't avoid seeing some truth.
Yeah.
No, are you talking about that in terms of producing art or consuming art?
Both. I was thinking about it in terms of, well, there's two things. I mean, I was thinking about it in terms of consuming art, that this is a way that art can actually play a role in our lives, even in helping. It can be a means, actually, by which the Holy Spirit helps to sanctify us in some instances, not every instance. But in creating art, you can also think about kind of the paradox that I was saying earlier about non-Christians who live in a created world, who see evidence of God, we're told in the Bible, but don't call it God, creating art that then actually has real truth and bearing on the world, but they themselves don't even recognize it. So in that sense, like when you're creating art, you can be thinking about, if you're a Christian, you can be thinking about that in terms of, is this something that is helping me learn something about God, or that I can help other people learn something, or if you're not a Christian, you're not even thinking about it in those terms, but it might still play that role. Yeah.
Can you talk more about how I don't know if I heard you correctly. You can't teach how to do good art.
Yeah. That's your question?
Yeah.
So you can teach, I mean, people go to school for art. Often they spend a ton of money on it. So it's not true that you can't teach things related to the art profession, the art world. You can certainly teach people how to paint. You can teach people how to make a sculpture. You can teach people music, like whatever it is. You can teach different mediums, basically. And that's where, like, the second category I had about material is really important, because you should be an excellent craftsman in your own medium. And that's often what you go to school for. But I think it's the third thing, or it's the first and third thing, like creative inspiration and reality revelation, or basically this revealing of the truth. Those two things I don't think you can teach as much. Inspiration, who knows where it comes from. And revealing something about reality, some people might do a better job at it than others, and sometimes the people who do a really good job at it are not the ones who went to school to learn something about art. So,
Could you, follow-up question, could you
Yeah.
say that if you were more advanced in your God knowledge and self-knowledge, that is teachable and therefore is also part of teaching art?
I would say yes, but it's teachable in the context primarily of philosophy and religious studies, or church, or whatever. So,
And also just living life,
and just living life.
having experiences.
So,
Different people have different appreciations, though. One person would see that and say it's nothing. It doesn't mean it is nothing.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that person's wrong either. Maybe they appreciate something else that that person wouldn't appreciate.
yeah. I mean, subjectivity gets into it a lot, especially when you're looking at art. The thing that's been most helpful for me, actually, because there are so many different kinds of art, and some of them I really like, some of them I dislike,
Right.
is looking at what the artist was actually thinking about when they made it. So if I saw this and I didn't know anything about Agnes Martin, I would probably just think, like, that's another abstract painting of a grid. But for me, like, knowing that she was saying this, like talking about the innocence of trees and perfection and beauty, like that brings a whole nother level into the piece that if I hadn't known, I wouldn't have even saw.
Isn't it, following up on that, isn't it then sort of the case that the total work of art is not just the thing, but also the framing of the thing? That it's the story that is told in the little card is a part of the artwork itself. In some ways.
I think it is. I think the real thing is our ability to see what's there. Because I think if the artist is thinking about it, at least a hint of it is there. I mean, she gives us the title, the tree, so she kind of sets us off down that path. But for many of us, like we're not in tune enough with either the artist or the type of work that it is to be able to see these things by ourselves. So on one hand, it's training ourselves to see better. And on the other hand, it's reading the plaque, studying the artist, kind of educating ourselves as to what they were actually thinking about when they made it. So, yeah, definitely.
Along those lines, like who decides like what the art means? Is it the artist or is it the person consuming the art?
I don't think anybody decides. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, so if you hear artists talk in kind of the general art world today, sort of the like mantra that you hear over and over again is, it doesn't matter what I say, it's about whatever the people want to bring to it or take from it or have it project on them or whatever. So they're saying when someone walks into a museum, they've come from like getting coffee with a friend, but last night they were watching this terrible movie that scared them, / they're going through a divorce. Like they're bringing all this stuff into the museum. They see a piece of art, they project all that emotion on it, that's what it means to them, right? So that's kind of the typical thought right now, is like whatever the artist was thinking doesn't matter, it's out the window. Artists are saying that themselves.
But then the art doesn't matter. I mean, then the art serves no real purpose aside
Exactly. So I think I would say like it matters what the artist intends, but they're not always going to be there to explain it. So if it's a successful artwork, hopefully it kind of explains it or gets it across without the artist having to be there.
Well, that really varies over time. Like if you look at art history, like that's about current contemporary art. So.
And I think we're good.
Could you also say that that is one of the things that differentiates good and bad art? Because there's a painting maybe similar to this in the style or philosophy that just aren't done as well and lack the ability to actually communicate what the artist is trying to do.
Yeah. I think it is kind of a hallmark of how successful the piece is.
You're
But
saying what is the effect? How much persists even without knowing all the backstory?
yeah, how much of the original intent persists without the artist being there, I think is a kind of metric of how successful it is. But I will also say like a lot of that actually depends on your knowledge of the genre in general in which the artist is working. So if you're not familiar at all with kind of mid-century abstract paintings, like you're probably going to miss a lot of where this artist is coming from to begin with. So helping or educating yourself just on the genre before you look at a specific example is helpful. Because I'll say there's pieces that look exactly like this, but the artist was saying, God is dead, nothing's real, you know, we're just putting pigment on the canvas. So it really takes a sort of educating yourself in the genre to sort of fine-tune and differentiate between two modes of thinking in very similar pieces. So.
Wasn't there a time when they had like a monkey do paintings and then it was accepted as art?
I'm sure.
A monkey.
Yeah, I'm sure that happened. I think.
They had
I
computers.
mean, it was accepted by somebody at least.
Yeah.
So that was kind of that one phase you showed about artists and experience.
So again, like knowing a little bit about the history of art can help, because that would be considered a type of conceptual art, meaning it's about the art is actually the concept in your mind about the art. The art is not the physical piece that was produced. So basically the whole art is the monkey making the piece and then calling that piece art. The artwork is not just the
You
piece
have
that the
to
monkey
include
makes.
the monkey in order to appreciate the whole.
Exactly.
I think.
So this guy putting a toilet in a museum, there's nothing special about the toilet. It's just the fact that he was like, I'm going to put that piece of material in the museum. That's the artwork. So it's really kind of playing with your mind about what do you consider as the role of the artist in creating how do you conceive of like what is art and what is not. So like how much does the context of the art play?
Which goes back to framing again,
Yeah.
sort of the story that is either told about it or that you imagine about it when you're looking at it.
Yeah.
Elizabeth had something.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We sort of have talked around this a bit, but would you say that a work of art means something on its own apart from anybody's interpretation of it?
Like, does it mean something to someone looking at it?
Is it just meaningful in itself?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, that comes from me thinking, again, that point I had about creation having latent meaning. There are people who say the world is meaningless, right? Like, a tree has no meaning in and of itself. But we think that because God created it, a tree has meaning in and of itself. So I think material, like the material world, has kind of a dignity and a value without anyone placing that value on it. So I would say the same thing about a work of art.
I think about the Egyptian art, we know absolutely nothing about what they were thinking.
Yeah.
Right? In a sense, everything that we know about what they were thinking is from looking at their art.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. But I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you think of an example of an obviously bad piece of art? You said good art. Well, I don't know.
It's saying something
When you
false.
described it, it's not that that's bad, but
I mean,
yeah,
this
what
one's,
would be an example of here's a piece of art that just
Yeah, because it's
So-
subjective, really.
I didn't really get into this, and it's a really touchy subject. There's lots of art that's very concerned with the social movements going on in its time and place. So there's art about peace movements, there's art about racism, there's art about sexism, there's art about gender issues, there's art about the political division in our country that's happening right now. So I can't say that any of those specifically are bad things, because a lot of them really do need to be kind of brought up and talked about. But is it art that's going to last the test of time? Does it go beyond kind of the subject matter of sort of the social uprising that is created in, and say something greater about humanity that in 100 years is still going to be, thought of as profound or applicable? I don't know. So there's lots of examples in galleries and museums now where you walk in and it's really about politics, or it's really about a social movement. And again, a lot of it is probably worthwhile and worth looking at, but is it going to stand the test of time? I'm not sure.
So do you think that's a valid test of good and bad art?
I think in general, yeah.
It speaks to multiple generations.
Yeah. I think if you're adequately educated about the context in which it was made, so you can kind of, if that was super important to it, you can kind of see that. But generally, if it's saying something that's really true to humans, it's going to sort of stand up in 100 years or 200 years from now.
So let me throw something out, maybe bouncing off what Rick was saying. To some degree, you can say like what's motivating the artist will control through, to some degree, the goodness and badness, and some of that will come out to the doer. So for instance, if the artist is really just motivated by what will make me money, or what will make people like me because I say the politically correct things, like, it tends to be, like you say, at least very narrow to a specific crowd of people they're trying to please. Whereas I kind of think that what you're talking about with the passion at the very beginning, there is a sense in which I think every artist says to themselves, like, I'm making something that's objectively good, even if other people don't see it. Like, I know in my heart of hearts that this is really objectively good. Even if they kind of are a subjectivist and they don't believe in absolute right and wrong or absolute good and bad, I still think that they tell themselves, like, no, this is really something good that I've made, and I'm really proud of it. And to some degree, even if they're doing that for a very anti-God motive, like there's an integrity to that that is better than just somebody who's just like, what can I crank out to make some dollars?
Exactly, yeah.
Just to clarify, so when we're talking about good and bad art, it seems like we're talking about like a binary evaluation of like it's good or bad. But I don't think that's how a lot of artists would evaluate art. I think there's more of a spectrum and like different points of evaluation.
Yeah.
And you had kind of your three main things. So is it fair to like even just throw out the idea of absolute good and bad art and say like it hits these two criteria really well and kind of fails us as Christians on a third category,
Yeah.
or whatever, you know?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think the terms good and bad are super helpful in art. According to my definition, it'd be if art is not revealing anything true, it's probably not super worthwhile. That being said, it could still get at, like you can have art that does two of these really well and a third not so well. Is that good or bad? I don't know. It's probably good, but it might not really be art. Like if you're saying you have reality revelation and material down pat, but the inspiration isn't really there, like the seed of it isn't really there, it's probably still a good piece of work.
Seems like something could fail in an objective way. Like, so for instance with music, you know, like if you just literally can't write music, you put the notes in all the wrong places,
Yeah.
you know, or you know, mess up with the turpentine on your painting, you know, like you can objectively kill it
Yeah.
by doing, you know, number two really badly.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is you could be really good at technique and be insipid and nobody really cares. You know,
Right.
being good at technique is not sufficient, but I think it is a necessary criterion. Like there is some minimum level that it has to hit.
Yeah.
Even, sorry, one more thing. Even there though, so like some of the kind of reaction to something like the toilet, right? You could say, okay, well, the creative inspiration is really good, quote unquote, and the reality revelation is really advanced.
Yeah.
But like the material, like okay, he didn't really do much. Right? He just
Well,
chopped it off the wall.
Just to be devil's advocate, I'll push back there,
Right.
because it's not saying that, it's not necessarily saying like the physical material itself has to be high quality. It's just saying that the artist's use of the material has to be well intended, or well thought out, I should say.
Right.
So in his instance, his whole thing was actually about material. He was saying, well, not all, but he was saying industrial made objects that we see in our everyday life, like toilets, wheels, you know, coffee grinders, whatever. Those can be works of art if they're in the right context. So he actually just wasn't manipulating material, but he was recognizing material.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
whether you call that a good use of material or not, I don't know, but
Right.
there was some intentionality to it at least.
But I think that's a way of thinking about evaluating on a deeper level.
Yes.
Than just, yeah.
For sure.
Is that a whole different kind of art?
What, to take like everyday
Artifact-
objects?
Yeah, everyday objects and making them beautiful.
Yeah, so now there's this whole movement called found art, and by found, it's made by found objects, and by found objects they mean object that you find, as in you repurpose it, you don't create it yourself. So I don't know if this was the genesis of that movement, but yeah, it's kind of a different kind of thing where people take like forks and CDs and like glue them together and make sculptures and whatever. So
I wasn't necessarily thinking in that term, but just take a fork. A fork can have
yeah.
beauty, it can feel especially good in your hand, it can look beautiful. You know.
So that's a really interesting question, because basically, like, can an everyday object be art by itself? I think, because it involves several things. It involves our ability to see it as art, right, and experience it as art. But the intention was never there. People aren't in the factory making a fork being like, this is a work of art that's going to end up in the museum of the person's
But
dinner
the
table.
designer,
The designer
original designer of the.
could definitely have been thinking in a very artful way about the fork. So,
Bruce and I had a debate about this that
Yeah.
went on for like 2 hours. So.
yeah, that's, I'll let you
Craftsmanship
ponder that.
versus art.
Yeah.
It's a
Um,
long
In that
conversation.
situation, though, it's not really revealing much about the human nature or about God, right? So it kind of
But it might be revealing something about the beauty in the created world. One last thing about that point, the guy who was a student, oh, sorry. The guy who was a student of this artist and did very similar stuff, like it was about the experience. At the end, or in an interview towards the end of his career, he basically said, he was sitting in a cafe in New York and he was looking at the building facade across from him, And he's basically like, light hitting the facade of a building can be art if we only saw it. So for him, it was really about, if your mind is trained to see the beauty in the world, then that becomes art. So.
Well, in some sense, there's a common theme of what I would call deliberateness, of kind of like, I keep coming back to this word framing, but like, you know, even when like, you know, somebody snaps a picture on their iPhone, but like it causes you to pause and actually look at that scene and sort of ponder it a little bit, as opposed to you could walk past it 100 times a day and never like notice it. So there's sort of a, whether it's a message of a urinal or you know whatever it is, it's sort of like a pausing and saying, look at this carefully.
Yeah.
And think about a story of some sort rather than just brush past and not even notice.
Yeah.
Okay, we should probably move on.
Okay.
Unless, I mean,
Yeah, hold your question until the end.
Maybe
We'll
one more.
have more
Got it.
questions. Oh, you want to do one more? Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I was wondering what you thought of artists like Jackson Pollock, who I think in some of his paintings his truth was the randomness
Yeah.
of life, and that's what he was trying to depict. But that was his truth.
Mhm.
And so what do you think of, as Christians, you know, we reject randomness as a truth. However, was an artist, he's creating art, and that was, to the best of his ability, that was depicting his truth.
Yeah, so Jackson Pollock's a really interesting example. I think for him it was about randomness, and it was about his personal truth. But you can go look at a Jackson Pollock painting, and there are actually people who analyze the paint splatters for kind of the physics of what was going on when the paint hit the canvas. So you could actually make a case that his paintings were depicting the physical reality of a created world in how paint splatters on the surface. Now, does that get at art? Maybe, I don't know, like you can decide that, but I think there's a different way of looking at things like that, even when the artist is saying this is totally random.
Or is he conveying the human emotion of despair?
So that's another thing is, sometimes an artist that's completely lost in despair can actually convey something about that experience that resonates with people who are in a similar place, but are sort of coming from a, you know, Christ-centric viewpoint or something. So.
Yeah, I always kind of think of it like there's artists, I think about this a lot with songwriters who maybe adequately understand the brokenness of the world, but they don't have the gospel, and so they are still conveying truth, but only half of the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But what they're conveying is still very real and like very felt by all of us.
Yeah.
So you
I
can
mean,
learn something from that.
There's certainly many people who in their lives feel like God doesn't exist and that the world is completely dark and broken. And even if they come out of that at some point, or know in their psyche that it's not true, then the art can still resonate with them in that period.
Well, this is like Daniel's stated, there's two types of art that can look really similar. One is of a non-Christian who's reaching out for something deeper and not finding it. And the other is of a Christian who's becoming very cynical and selfish over time. And they kind of meet at a crossing point, but the vectors are very different.
Yeah.